The men reached the ridge just after sunrise, when the snow was still hard enough to walk on without sinking. They had not come to visit. They had come to confirm something, and to bring a shovel, in case the ground beneath the cabin still needed to be broken open. For 3 days, the wind had not stopped. The kind of wind that pulls the warmth out of a body before a person even understands what is happening to them. The kind of wind that had, in the past, left more than one homestead silent by morning. Eleanor Whitfield lived alone on that ridge, in a cabin her husband had built, and then left behind when his heart gave out the previous autumn. She had no grown sons nearby, no hired hand, no cattle worth mentioning. By the time the first snow had fallen, half the valley had already decided how her winter would end. So the men walked up with their hats low and their voices lower, rehearsing, without quite meaning to, what they would say when they found her. And then one of them stopped walking. He had caught a smell that made no sense at all. It was not smoke. Smoke, they expected. Every chimney for miles had been breathing smoke for days. It was bread. Warm, unmistakable, rising bread, drifting out through a crack in the shutters as if the storm outside had never happened at all. No one said anything for a moment. They only stood there, snow still falling on their shoulders, listening to a sound coming from inside the cabin that none of them could explain either. Someone was humming. What they found when the door opened was not what any of them had prepared themselves for. And the reason for it had nothing to do with luck, and everything to do with a decision Eleanor had made weeks earlier, one that every single person on that ridge had told her, to her face, was a mistake. If you are watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like this one survive only because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier stories like this matter to you, staying subscribed helps keep them alive. To understand why anyone expected a body in that cabin, it helps to go back to the end of the previous summer, before the first frost had even touched the low fields. Eleanor Whitfield was 29 years old when her husband, Edmund, collapsed while splitting wood behind the barn. He had been a careful man, not a reckless one, and that was part of what made his death so hard for the valley to accept. If a careful man could fall in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, then careful was not enough to save anyone. He left behind a half-built woodpile, a cabin with a kitchen wall that had never quite kept the wind out, and a widow with no children, no hired hand, and no family closer than 3 days' ride. By the time the leaves had turned, Eleanor had already become a kind of quiet arithmetic problem for her neighbors. They counted her flour, her fence posts, her firewood, and her chances, and most of them arrived at the same uncomfortable number. Not enough. Amos Hendry, who farmed the next parcel over and had known Edmund since they were boys, said it plainly to his own wife at the supper table. He gave the widow until February, and he said it the way a man says something he does not enjoy believing, but believes anyway. No one said this to Eleanor's face. They did not need to. She had lived on that ridge long enough to read it in the way people looked at her woodpile instead of at her. What none of them accounted for was that Eleanor had spent every one of Edmund's last 3 winters watching him fight the same losing argument with that kitchen wall. Every year, no matter how much wood they burned, the far corner of the room stayed cold enough to keep milk from souring. Edmund had blamed the stove. He had blamed the door. He had never once blamed the wall itself. Eleanor had noticed something different. She had noticed that the cold did not simply exist in that corner. It seemed to arrive there every single evening from one particular direction at almost the same hour, regardless of how high the fire was built. She had not mentioned this to anyone, because there had never seemed to be a reason to. Now, with the first hard frost only weeks away, and half the valley already writing her winter's ending in advance, there was suddenly every reason in the world. The obvious path was the one every widow on that ridge was expected to take. Stack wood high against the door. Seal what gaps could be sealed with rag and mud. Pray for a mild season and ration the rest. Eleanor did not take that path. Instead, on a clear morning in early October, with perhaps 6 weeks left before the ground would freeze too hard to work, she began pulling loose stone from the dry creek bed below the ridge and hauling it, one armful at a time, towards the kitchen wall. Her plan, as she explained it to no one because no one asked, was to tear the weak section of that wall down to the frame and rebuild it thicker, using stone packed with clay instead of the thin board and daub Edmund had always meant to replace, and never had. It was, by any practical measure available to her neighbors, a terrible use of a widow's time. Stone was heavy. Clay was slow to dig, slow to mix, and slower still to dry properly before the first freeze. Every day she spent hauling rock from the creek was a day she did not spend cutting and splitting the firewood she would need to survive the winter, regardless of what her walls were made of. She knew this. She had done the arithmetic herself, more carefully than anyone watching her from a distance ever gave her credit for. What she was betting on was something harder to explain in a single sentence, and something she had never heard a name for. She had noticed, over 3 winters of watching Edmund feed that stove long into the night, that the wall itself seemed to hold a kind of memory of heat. Not much, not enough to matter on an ordinary night, but enough that she wanted, more than she wanted extra cords of wood, to give that memory somewhere solid to live. By the second week, her hands were split at the knuckles from the cold creek water, and the wall was only half torn down. The wood she had not yet cut sat waiting in an ever-shortening pile beside the shed. She was, by every visible measure, running out of time to do either job well. Amos Hendry rode over on the 14th day, ostensibly to return a borrowed harness buckle, though everyone on the ridge understood that a borrowed buckle was rarely the true reason for a visit that time of year. He found Eleanor kneeling in a half-demolished kitchen, her sleeves pushed up past the elbow, packing wet clay between 2 rows of creekstone with her bare hands. Amos was not a cruel man, and he did not laugh. What he did was worse, in its own quiet way. He asked questions that Eleanor could not easily answer, because they were good questions. He asked how much wood she had cut so far. She told him the truth, and watched him do the same arithmetic her neighbors had already done at their supper tables. He asked whether she understood that stone this heavy could pull a poorly built wall down onto itself before the mortar ever properly cured, especially with an early hard freeze, which the geese and the color of the sky had both been suggesting all week. He asked, not unkindly, whether Edmund would have approved of tearing out a working wall 2 months before the snow. Eleanor did not have a clean answer to that last question, because Edmund would almost certainly not have approved. He had been a patient man in most things, but not with structural risk, and not with his wife's safety. What she told Amos instead was simpler than an argument. She told him that the old wall had never once, in 3 winters, kept that corner of the kitchen warm, no matter how much wood they burned trying to force it to. She said she did not intend to spend another winter feeding a fire, that a wall was quietly wasting. Amos looked at the half-finished stone, at her split knuckles, and at the dwindling woodpile by the shed. And he said, with something close to genuine regret, that he hoped she was right, because there would not be time to change course if she was wrong. He rode home and told his wife that evening that the widow Whitfield had lost her senses along with her husband. He did not say it to hurt anyone. He said it because, from where he stood, it appeared to be simply true. The first hard frost came 9 days later, earlier than even Amos had predicted. and it arrived on a north wind that found every weakness a wall could have. Eleanor's new stone section was finished by then, though not cured as long as she would have liked, and for the first 2 nights it seemed to hold. The kitchen felt different, not dramatically warmer, but steadier, as though the cold were being kept at arm's length rather than let in through the front door. On the 3rd night, a thin cracking sound woke her a little after midnight. She found the source near the base of the new wall, close to where the old timber frame met the fresh stone. A crack, no wider than a fingernail, had opened straight through the clay, and cold air was moving through it in a thin, steady line she could feel against her palm from 3 feet away. By morning, the fire that had burned steadily all night had nearly gone out, and the water bucket by the hearth had a skin of ice across the top that had never formed there before, not even during Edmund's last winter. It would have been easy, standing in that kitchen with frost on the inside of a wall she had spent 9 days building, to conclude that Amos had been right, and that she had wasted her last good weeks of preparation on a stone that could not even keep its own crack shut. Eleanor did not allow herself that conclusion, mostly because she did not have time to. What she allowed herself instead was a single, narrow question. The crack had not opened randomly along the wall's length. It had opened in exactly one place, at exactly the seam where old timber met new stone, on exactly the side the wind came from. That was not bad luck. That was information. She spent the rest of that day with her hand pressed flat against different sections of the wall, feeling for temperature, for draft, for the places where the stone felt merely cold and the places where it felt actively wrong. What she was doing had no name she knew of. It looked, to anyone passing by the window, very much like a woman standing in her own kitchen touching a wall for no reason at all. She did not yet know whether what she found that afternoon would be enough to save the coming winter. She knew only that the wall had just told her something the old one never had. The crack had opened where old timber met new stone, on the side the wind struck first. That much Eleanor already understood. What she needed to understand next was why the cold seemed to travel through that one seam and nowhere else, when the whole wall had been built from the same clay and the same care. She spent 2 mornings doing something that would have looked, to any passing neighbor, like a woman losing patience with her own kitchen. She pressed her palm flat against the stone in a slow line, section by section, waiting each time for her hand to tell her something her eyes could not. Most of the wall felt simply cold, the way stone is always cold in early winter. But near the old timber frame, in a band no wider than 2 hands, the cold felt different, sharper, moving, as though the wind outside had found a crack no thicker than a knife and was pouring itself through it a little at a time. She also noticed something she had not expected. The section of wall closest to the stove, the part she had packed thickest with clay, did not feel merely less cold. By late afternoon, hours after she had let the morning fire burn down, it still felt faintly warm to the touch, warmer than the floor, warmer than the iron pot hanging beside it. Eleanor had no word for what she was noticing. She only knew that the stone nearest the fire seemed to be holding on to the day's heat and letting it go slowly, long after the flames themselves had gone quiet. So she made 2 decisions. The first was practical and immediate. She tore open the cracked seam, repacked it with a denser mix of clay and ash, and pressed a thin layer of dried moss into the gap before sealing it, something her grandmother had once done to a chimney, and which Eleanor had never expected to need herself. The second decision was riskier. She began moving her heaviest stones, the ones she had originally placed for looks rather than function, to the section of wall directly behind the stove, even though that meant tearing out clay she had only finished curing 4 days earlier. Amos, riding past on his way to check a fence line, saw her doing this and did not stop to ask why. He had already decided weeks earlier that questioning the widow Whitfield's choices had stopped being useful. He simply noted to himself that she was still out there, and that the smoke from her chimney still looked steady against a sky that was starting to threaten something larger than an ordinary frost. The proof, when it came, arrived quietly, on a night that was cold, but not yet dangerous. Eleanor let the evening fire burn down earlier than usual, partly from exhaustion, and partly out of curiosity she had not admitted to herself. She wanted to know, without a fire actively fighting the cold, what her wall would actually do once it was left alone. By 9 that evening, the stove had gone from a low glow to nearly nothing. She expected the familiar creep of cold that had haunted that corner of the kitchen for 3 winters under Edmund's care. It did not come, or rather, it came slower and weaker than she had ever felt it before. She sat with her back against the section of wall she had rebuilt behind the stove and felt something she almost did not trust. Warmth. Not the sharp warmth of an active fire, but a low, steady, patient warmth, coming out of stone that had not seen flame in hours. It lasted, by her own rough counting, somewhere between 4 and 6 hours before fading into ordinary cold. It was not enough to carry her through an entire night on its own. It was not enough to replace the wood she still needed to cut. But it was enough to prove that the stone was doing something the old wall never had, taking in heat during the hours she could spare to feed the fire, and returning a portion of it during the hours she could not. Her dog, a lean gray shepherd mix named Scout that had wandered onto the property the previous spring and simply stayed, seemed to notice it too. Instead of curling near the stove itself, as he had done every night since the weather turned, he shifted that evening to the base of the rebuilt wall and did not move again until morning. Eleanor watched him do this and said nothing out loud, though she found herself, for the first time in weeks, allowing a small and cautious kind of hope. What she did not yet know was that this quiet test, on an ordinary cold night with no wind worth mentioning, was not the winter's real question. The real question was still coming, and it would not give her the luxury of a slow, gentle evening to prove herself in. Word of the coming storm reached the ridge 9 days later, carried by a rider from the county seat who stopped at 3 homesteads on his way through and repeated the same warning at each one. A system was moving down from the north, larger and colder than anything the valley had seen in almost a decade, and it was expected to close every road within 2 days. Amos rode over that afternoon, not to question Eleanor's wall this time, but to ask, in a tone far more careful than the one he had used in October, whether she wanted to bring what animals she had down to his barn before the roads shut, and whether she had considered staying with his family until the worst of it passed. It was, in its own way, the offer the entire valley had been withholding since Edmund died. An offer of shelter that would have solved every one of her problems at once, and would have required, in exchange, only that she admit the wall she had built was not enough. Eleanor thanked him, and said no. She could not have fully explained why, even to herself. Part of it was pride, and she did not pretend otherwise. But a larger part of it was something closer to conviction. She had spent 2 months learning what that wall could do, hour by hour, section by section, in a way no one else had bothered to learn about their own homes. To leave now would mean surviving the storm, without ever finding out whether the thing she had built was actually enough. And she found that she wanted the answer more than she wanted the safety of not knowing. Amos did not argue. He only looked, one more time, at the woodpile by the shed, smaller than his own by a considerable margin, and at the chimney above it, still breathing steady smoke into a sky the color of old iron. He told her, as he mounted his horse, that he would come by the moment the roads opened, whatever he found when he got there. Eleanor spent that final evening before the storm, doing the same thing she had done every evening for 2 months. She fed the fire, checked the seam near the old timber frame, and pressed her palm once more against the stone behind the stove, feeling for the steady warmth that had, by then, become almost familiar. Outside, the wind had already begun to shift, and Scout stood at the door for a long time before finally settling, uneasily, at the base of the wall. The storm arrived a little after midnight, and within an hour it had become something closer to a living thing than a weather event. A wall of wind and snow that erased the tree line, the fence posts, and eventually the difference between the ground and the sky. For the first several hours, the wall held exactly as it had during her quieter test weeks earlier. The stove burned low but steady. The stone behind it stayed warm to the touch. Eleanor allowed herself, briefly, to believe the worst of the night might pass, without testing her the way she had feared. Then, sometime past 3 in the morning, the wind changed direction. It was a small shift, the kind that might have gone unnoticed by anyone not intimately familiar with every seam in that wall. But Eleanor had spent 2 months learning exactly where cold could enter if the wind ever came from that particular angle, and this was that angle. Scout felt it before she did. He rose from his place at the base of the wall and pressed himself against the old timber seam, the same spot that had cracked weeks earlier, whining low in his throat in a way Eleanor had never heard from him before. She was at the wall in seconds, palm flat against the stone, searching for the same thin, moving cold she had found in October. For a moment, in the near dark, with the stove's light barely reaching that corner of the room, she could not tell whether she was feeling a draft, or only her own fear of one. She had, in that moment, 3 choices, and no more than a few seconds to weigh them. She could tear open the wall right then, in the middle of the storm, and repack a seam she could barely see, risking a worse breach than the one she might be imagining. She could pull every remaining piece of dry wood into the kitchen and simply burn through the night at whatever cost, abandoning the wall's promise entirely. Or she could trust the repair she had already made in November, the dense clay and dried moss she had pressed into that seam with her own hands, and let the wall do, under real pressure, what it had only done so far under gentle conditions. She chose to trust it. She built the fire 1 size higher than usual, pressed a folded blanket along the base of the seam as a second line of defense, rather than a replacement for the first, and sat down beside Scout to wait out whatever the next few hours intended to prove. The wind held its new direction for nearly 4 hours before it finally began to ease, and Eleanor spent every one of those hours awake, feeding the stove in small, careful amounts, checking the blanket she had pressed against the seam, and listening to Scout's breathing slow gradually back to normal beside her. By the time gray light began to show through the shutters, the storm had not stopped entirely, but it had loosened its grip enough that the worst of the danger had clearly passed. Eleanor pressed her palm one more time against the stone behind the stove and found what she had been hoping to find for 6 hours. Warmth. Not dramatic, not triumphant, simply present, exactly where it needed to be. The road did not open for another 2 full days. When it finally did, Amos was among the first to make the climb up the ridge, accompanied by 2 other neighbors who had, in October, said things about Eleanor's judgment that none of them were eager to repeat out loud. They had come prepared for the worst. One of them carried a shovel, in case the ground beneath the cabin needed breaking. None of them had come prepared for what actually reached them first, which was the smell of bread rising through a crack in the shutters, warm and ordinary, and completely at odds with everything they had rehearsed on the walk up. When the door opened, they found Eleanor exactly as she had spent every morning of that winter, kneading dough at a table pushed close to the rebuilt wall, with Scout curled at her feet and a fire burning low and steady in the stove. Amos did not say anything about February or arithmetic or the visit in October when he had told her plainly that she had lost her senses. He only stood in the doorway for a long moment, hat in his hands, looking at the section of wall he had once called a waste of good working days. Eleanor offered him bread, warm from that morning's baking, and he accepted it without comment, though his wife would later say he ate it more slowly than a hungry man usually eats anything, as though he were trying to understand something with his mouth that his eyes had already failed to explain. It was Amos, not Eleanor, who eventually broke the silence. He asked quietly whether she would be willing to show him exactly how the stone behind his own stove might be arranged the same way before the next hard freeze arrived. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes, drawing on plausible frontier building practices from the era. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.